A while ago, there was some drama about which game was more difficult to play, Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! This drama went a few places, but the details there are less interesting than the overall question. What makes a card game hard? Is it the complexity of the individual turns, the complexity of the rule systems, or the multi-turn strategies that decks need to employ? Players from each of the three big card games will claim their game is the deepest and most skill-testing. But is there any truth to these claims? Today, we're going to go over what makes Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, and even Magic the Gathering difficult and how they compare to each other, and see if we can find an answer to the question, what's the hardest card game? One major aspect of a game's difficulty is its complexity, and that's an obvious place to start this discussion. Starting with Yu-Gi-Oh!, the game has many things that make it very difficult to get into and to master. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is famous for its high-powered combos and very complex rules, making it infamously difficult for new players to pick up. For one, the game has a ton of different summoning mechanics that new players have to learn. Fusion, Ritual, Synchro, Xyz, Pendulum, and Link summoning all come with their own quirks and rules, and to really play the game, you'll eventually have to learn how all of them work. On top of that, learning how to play a modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck is something that takes quite a bit of effort. Every Yu-Gi-Oh! Card is incredibly dense with effects text, and beyond knowing what every card does, you also need to know how a deck's cards interact with each other. This, at least for new players, usually amounts to either slowly building a base of knowledge by building your own decks, or by doing research into how certain decks are played, the latter being more common. It takes a lot of time to learn how to pilot a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck with anything even approximating a degree of skill. The next most complex game of the three is Magic, which is debatably as complex as Yu-Gi-Oh! Try asking a new player how humility and opalescence interact if you want to see proof of just how complicated Magic can be. Of course, these types of rule nightmares don't pop up in most games of Magic. This is a purposeful design choice on the part of Magic's designers, as this type of complexity is seen as a barrier to entry for new players. However, even when you ignore the heavy complexity of Magic's rule system, the actual rules of Magic are still more complicated than many other card games. Magic's mana system is by far the most complex of any card game with such a system. In order to cast a spell of Magic, you have to produce enough mana from your lands, but on top of having enough mana, you also need mana of the right colors. A card like Rogue Refiner requires at least 1 green and 1 blue mana, and you have to properly tap your land to create the right colors of mana. On top of keeping track of your colors of mana in order to cast your spells properly, you have cards like Lumbering Falls and Mirror Pool that have other useful activated abilities which you need to keep untapped in order to use. This alone creates a level of complexity while playing before you even get to the actual spells you're casting. Magic's mana system also introduces a type of decision making that Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon don't have, as rather than choosing just the order in which you play your cards, but instead only have so many resources that you can spend on your cards however you wish. This also has an impact on how you interact with your opponent, as most of your instant speed interaction or quick effect interaction comes in the form of instant spells. In order to even be able to interact with your opponent on their turn, you have to choose to not spend your mana on your turn, which is yet another thing you have to consider when going about your turn. Still, most Magic decks are easier to pick up and play than a modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, especially once you already know how to play a game of Magic. And finally, the least complex of these three games is Pokemon. Now, while the Pokemon TCG is the least complex of the three games, that's not to say it's simple. There's still quite a bit you need to keep track of on a given turn. While there aren't any cost to playing cards, you still have many restrictions. Item cards, which can be played from hand for no cost as many times as you want in a turn, have less impact than more restricted cards. Supporters may have stronger effects, but you can only play a single supporter card on each of your turns. On top of that, Pokemon also have a lot of hard ones per turns, just like Yu-Gi-Oh! That you have to keep track of when you're going about your turn. The evolution mechanic is also something you have to keep in mind. You can only play basic Pokemon from your hand. Then, on the turn after you play the basic, you can evolve it into a Stage 1 Pokemon. And then finally, it can be evolved into their next Stage 2 versions in a different turn. Then, there's the energy mechanic, which is the closest thing to normal summoning, or land drops in the other two games. Here, rather than allowing you to develop your board or get more mana, energy is used to pay for your attacks, and it's generally what determines the flow of a game of Pokemon, as if a Pokemon gets knocked out, they lose all their energy. Still, Pokemon is by far the easiest game to pick up of the big three, being the simplest to play on a second-to-second basis. It's also the only game that doesn't have consistent access to quick effects or instant speed effects. When it's your turn, you're the only one playing, which makes navigating your turns far more simpler. You're never going to try to evolve your Charmander only for your opponent to solemn judgment you. So, now that we've established which games are most complex, we should know which one is the most difficult, right? Well, that's not necessarily the case. While Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the most complex of the three, that doesn't translate to it being the most deep gameplay. While the combos are complicated and take some getting used to, once you learn how to do a combo in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's not that difficult to perform it in future games. For an example, let's take a look at a typical Snake Eyes combo. The combo for this deck is to use one of your consistency cards to get a Snake Eye Ash. You use it to get the effect of Snake Eye Poplar, which special summons itself with its own effect. Poplar then adds a Snake Eye Spell a Trap, which is usually original Sinful Spoil Snake Eye if it wasn't used to start the combo. Then you link off a Poplar for a Link 1 and put Poplar into your back row with its effect. You use Ash to send itself and Poplar to summon Snake Eye Oak from deck, which reborns Ash. Then you use Oak to send itself in the Link 1 to summon Snake Eye Flameberg Dragon. You send Flameberg and Ash to summon IP Masquerena and trigger Flameberg to resummon 2 of the other snakes. Then you link off one of them in IP to summon Promethean Princess to use her effect to resummon Flameberg. You then use Flameberg to put IP in the back row, then link off the Princess and Snake Eye to summon Salamangreat Raging Phoenix. Yes, that is complicated and takes a while to memorize, but once you know what to do, it's not difficult to perform. You do the same thing every time, assuming your opponent doesn't interrupt you with hand traps. And that's where most of the actual skill expression and the most difficult decision making comes in: interaction. The complexity of Yu-Gi-Oh! Combos itself isn't that deep. It's how those combos interact with hand traps and the like, and how combos have to diverge from interactions where the depth comes in. The thing is, you can get that kind of decision making from a game without these long, complicated combos. And there are other types of difficult decision making in Magic and Pokemon that don't exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! And vice versa. Ultimately, it's difficult to say what the hardest of these games is, as they each test very different skills and different people will find these games more or less difficult to play based on which of these skills they're naturally better at. Spoilers, that's the conclusion of this video, and we're not going to crown one of these games as the true hardest game for the smartest players. Part of the reason they've all survived for so long is that the games play very differently and have their own ways of testing players. However, just saying that doesn't mean much. It'd be a lot more interesting to go over the different ways that these games test their players and what makes each one of them more difficult than the others. Returning to Yu-Gi-Oh!, since we're on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Channel for this video, there are 2 types of decision making mostly unique to this game. One is playing with and against hand traps, and the other is trying to break boards. While Magic does have a few cards similar to hand traps, such as Force of Will and its ilk, 0 mana cards are far less common in the game than hand traps are in Yu-Gi-Oh! Not to mention that most decks aren't going to be trying to pull off a crazy combo in Magic, and even the ones that aren't really going to try and play around cards like Force of Will in the same way you'd play around hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Often, what makes or breaks a deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is how well it can play around various hand traps. It's worth pointing out that these hand traps all have very different effects to one another. Playing around Ash Blossom is different to playing around Drone Lockbird or Nibiru. However, there's comparatively less variety in hand traps in Magic. You mostly have Force of Will and variants of it, which simply say counter target spell at the end of the day. There is some variety with cards like Revenous Trap and Mindbreak Trap and the like, but they see comparatively less play to Force variants, and way less than the far more conditional hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Whereas if you're baited in Ash Blossom, you may lead with a search you care less about. But if you're expecting your opponent to droll you, then you need to add your most important card from your deck to your hand first as quickly as possible. And of course, knowing when you actually should use your various hand traps is also a skill. Sure, you can look up a YouTube guide about where to hand trap various decks, but that can only get you so far when it comes to sticky situations where things just aren't going as normal. The hand trap game is something that is emphasized more in Yu-Gi-Oh! Than any other card game out there. Hand traps are mostly relevant on the first turns of the game, whereas breaking apart boards comes up on the second turn of the game. People joke a lot about staring down a board of 3 negates and getting every card in your hand negated, but with how common hand traps are nowadays, this very rarely actually happens. However, you'll probably have to be playing into a board with some amount of disruption, and forcing this disruption out of your opponent properly is key when going second in Yu-Gi-Oh! One of the things that makes this so different to any other card game is that usually you can read all the interactions your opponent has available, but you won't know how they'll use them. You don't know when your opponent will use the Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, and most decks have enough extension that they might be able to play through one or two pieces of interaction like this. A lot of second turns in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are almost a game of chicken, one player waiting to use their interaction at the most optimal time, while the turn player tries to make them use it prematurely so they can pull off their combo. The fact that the most powerful interactions in the game is on monsters who are all on the field when they can use their effects means that navigating that interaction is kind of flipped to how it works in most other card games. In games like Magic, or even in older Yu-Gi-Oh!, the interaction was on instants or trap cards, and the turn player would make plays and hope that their opponent doesn't have the out. However, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, the player whose information is all known is the player with the interaction, so the turn player is the only one who needs to have the out in the form of more extension. At the end of the day, these types of high-powered combo-based interactions are the main skill that Yu-Gi-Oh! Tests in the modern day, which is pretty different to how the other two biggest games play out. Moving on to Magic, the game most similar to Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic also has a lot of instant speed interaction and hand trap equivalents. However, as we talked about before, they have far less hand trap style cards. Most interaction will be in the form of standard instant spells, which require keeping up mana to be used on your opponent's turn. We talked about this a bit before, but it's worth saying that this is a skill all on its own. Knowing if you need to develop your board or if your resources are better spent trying to stop your opponent is something that comes with time, and it's a skill that games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon don't test thanks to just how different their resource systems are. Another big difference between Magic and the other two card games are its draw and search power, or more specifically, the lack of draw and search power in Magic. While Magic does get cards like Quick Study that allow you to simply draw two cards, whereas Pot of Greed is taking an extensive vacation on Yu-Gi-Oh!'s ban list, the actual impact of these cards is diminished in the average game. Since you have to spend mana on draw spells that you can't spend on playing creatures or playing interaction, many decks play few to no cards that allow them to draw or search cards out of their deck. Whereas nowadays, most Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon decks can draw half their decks on their first turn if they want to. This means that Magic is often less a game of finding a particular card that you need to win the game, and more one making the best with what cards you do find. While there are decks built around particular cards, these are usually dedicated combo decks. The average deck is built to be able to play even if you never draw a single copy of a particular card, which changes deck building and how you have to play the game turn by turn. Magic is a game about playing around variants and top decks, and playing to your outs, or playing around what cards you could draw that could potentially win you the game. It's just more emphasized here than in the other card games. Magic also has a very different combat system to Yu-Gi-Oh!, with keywords like flying and menace changing what creatures can block what, making attacking and blocking a much more involved process. Combine this with the various combat tricks, and you have the most complex combat system out of the three games. Magic is also the only game of the three with voluntary mulligans. Rather than being stuck with your opening hand, you can choose to shuffle it back and then draw a new 7 cards. But every time you do this, you have to put one extra card from your hand on the bottom of your deck when you finish mulliganing. Learning how to properly mulligan is a skill that Magic players have to learn that is unique to it versus some other card games, including Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon. Magic has a lot of the same complexities of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and its combo decks do involve some of the same skills. But its lower power level in terms of search and draw, as well as its combat system, shifts the focus of the game to something very different. And finally, we have the easiest game to pick up, Pokemon. Whereas Magic had the same quick effect interaction that Yu-Gi-Oh! Had, Pokemon shares its long, combo-y turns as players try to set up their board and play various item and supporter cards to find their important pieces. The way you go about doing these combos is also very different, as Pokemon has by far the best draw power of the three games, but worse search power than Yu-Gi-Oh! Overall, meaning that its combo lines diverge far more than Yu-Gi-Oh! Combos do. For example, if you're playing Gardevoir EX, the goal of your deck is to evolve a Ralts all the way to Gardevoir while filling your discard with psychic energy that Gardevoir can get back. Then, you power up attackers like Screamtail out of nowhere, usually ones that take advantage of the fact that attacking energy with Gardevoir requires damaging them. To do this, you use cards like Earthen Vessel and Ultra Ball to discard extra energy in your hand, which requires first adding those energies to hand or drawing into them. The combo is less a series of individual lines that the deck can do, and more a general end goal that your cards are all trying to work towards. Another really important difference between Pokemon and the other games is how few cards interact with the discard pile, what both other games call their graveyard. The best you'll usually get is a few cards that shuffle cards from your graveyard back into your deck, like maybe a card like Fisherman, which lets you pick up some energy cards from your discard pile and put them back in your deck. There are also very few cards with effects while they're in the discard pile, like Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh have, and almost no cards that let you put cards from your discard pile into play. This means that cards that go to your discard are effectively gone for good. This makes managing the cards you have left in your deck a skill all on its own, whereas this is usually seen as a non-issue in Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! There's also the fact that Pokemon has no sideboard, which means that any tech cards you want to play for particular matchups have to be played in your main deck at all times. This can be a real headache if your deck is weak to cards like Darkness Ablaze Decidueye, whose Deep Forest Camo ability stopped it from taking any damage from any Pokemon V or Pokemon GX, which were the strongest Pokemons in the game at the time. This card could wall an entire deck off. And if you weren't prepared to deal with it in Game 1, you just weren't ever going to be able to stop the card. This makes the 60 card deck slots precious in Pokemon, and deck building properly is a real challenge. Even if you do have ways to get around these tech cards, you'll only have a few. And since reoccurring cards in the discard is so difficult, losing it could mean you just lost the game. So in summary, Yu-Gi-Oh is a card game about performing and stopping powerful combos and baiting out quick effect or instant speed interaction. Magic is a game about combat and managing probability, and Pokemon is a game about performing your combos while keeping track of all of your available resources. If you play these games for any meaningful amount of time, you'll quickly realize just how different they feel to play. And in fact, you may learn a thing or two that makes you better at your game of choice. Personally, I, the scriptwriter, can say that after getting into Pokemon for a while, I looked at both Yu-Gi-Oh and Magic differently and got a lot better at both. Talking about whose game is harder or more skilled mostly serves to pat people's egos more than it does to accurately describe any of the games or their player bases. If this weren't true, you'd see people crossing over into other card games and winning all the prize support without even trying. And that just doesn't happen. We'd all be better off trying to learn what we can, or just saying that a game isn't for you and moving on.